Whispers through the drift. A Mick and Mack mystery. A snowstorm buries Toronto in chaos, but also buries a body, hidden in plain sight beneath the drifts in the shadow of City Hall. As the city digs itself out, so do Mick and Mack, uncovering a murder obscured not just by snow, but by a tangled web of revenge, justice, and deception. Welcome back to Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. I'm Jay Nickel of Nickel Investigations, and you're listening to another Whodunit Wednesday, where we step into the world of classic detective fiction. Tonight we travel back to a time of sharp suits, wise cracks, and dangerous names, where the neon glow of a late-night diner was the only thing between a gumshoe and trouble. Before I go on, with spring approaching, I'd like to mention a great product and website for those thinking of the golf course. 420 Golf Apparel, where we are bringing class to the short grass. What's in your closet? And teeing it up with Teddy Mack and the Digital Guru on 4rightpodcast.com. Hello, I'm Jay Nickel of Nickel Investigations, and this is an Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. Fictional episode, Whodunit Wednesdays, and a Mick and Mack mystery. Go back to the golden era of detective fiction. Enjoy stories in the tradition of the greats of writing, from Agatha Christie to Raymond Chandler to John Creasy. These are short stories. I hope you enjoy. Whispers Through the Drift, a Mick and Mack mystery. Chapter 1. The Discovery in the Snow. The morning after the worst snowstorm of the season, Toronto was groaning back to life. The storm had buried the city under a thick white shroud, leaving drifts piled high against buildings, sidewalks transformed into icy trenches, and the streets still littered with abandoned vehicles whose owners had given up the fight against the elements. The air carried the sharp metallic bite of cold, and the low winter sun struggled to penetrate the lingering gray clouds. In the courtyard of City Hall, the silence of dawn was interrupted by the steady scrape of a snow shovel. Gus Leary, a city worker for the past 15 years, had seen his fair share of winter storms. He cursed as he hoisted another shovelful of snow off the walkway, his breath visible in the frigid air. His back ached, his fingers were stiff inside his gloves, and his nose ran like a leaky tap. What really irked him was how no one ever appreciated the hard work it took to clear paths for people who just trampled through them without a second thought. He muttered under his breath as he worked, hacking away at a particularly stubborn mound of snow that had drifted against the base of one of the building's towering Gothic arches. Scrape, thunk. The shovel met resistance. Leary frowned. Ice? A buried trash can? He adjusted his grip and jabbed at the obstruction again. Thunk. A dull, unnatural sound. Curiosity replaced frustration. He bent down, gloved fingers brushing away layers of snow. And then he saw it. A hand. Frozen stiff. Fingers curled in a half-clenched grasp. Leary stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he simply stared, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. Then, as the truth settled in, he dropped his shovel and sprinted for the nearest patrolman. By the time Detective Mick McCathie and his partner, Detective MacNeely, arrived on the scene, a small crowd had gathered despite the biting cold. Uniformed officers held back onlookers, their breath fogging in the air as they muttered about the poor devil in the snow. The crime scene was roped off hastily, but given the chaos the storm had left in its wake, it was already compromised by footprints and trampling boots. Mick, tall and wiry, adjusted his brown fedora and surveyed the scene with sharp blue eyes. Mac, broader and more easygoing, pulled his scarf tighter around his neck and let out a low whistle. Nothing like a fresh corpse to start the morning, Mac quipped. Maybe we should open a bakery. Less murder, more muffins. "You hate baking," Mick muttered, stepping carefully around the snowdrifts to get a closer look at the body. The victim lay partially buried, face down, one arm reaching toward the base of the archway as if clawing for escape. His dark overcoat was dusted with frost, and his hat had rolled a few feet away, half covered in snow. The wind had done a number on him, but there was something strange about how he was positioned. Mick crouched down and pulled on his gloves before carefully brushing more snow away. No blood in the snow around him, he noted, and his coat stiff. The body heat should have kept it from freezing over so fast. Mac frowned. "You're thinking he didn't die here?" "I'm thinking someone put him here," Mick replied, "after the fact." Dump job in the middle of a blizzard. Risky move. But maybe that was the point. Mac glanced around. Courtyard's tucked away enough that someone could drag him in without too many prying eyes. And with all the snow, the body's just another heap in the drift. Mick nodded grimly. A uniformed officer approached. "ID in the stiffer," he reported, holding out a wallet. "Gerald Lawson, accountant." Mac took the wallet, flipping through it. "Well, Jerry, who did you cross to end up colder than my mother-in-law's glare?" He pulled out a ticket stub from the Majestic Theater, marked for the previous night. "Looks like he took in a show before someone took him out." Mick took the ticket and examined it. "We'll have to talk to the theater staff, see if they remember him." He reached in the victim's overcoat, feeling around for anything else of interest. His fingers closed around something small, metallic, and cold. He pulled out a pocket watch. Cracked. His hand stopped at 9:47. Mac raised an eyebrow. "Bit dramatic, don't you think?" "Or precise." Mick studied it. "This stopped when he died. We've got a time of death." Mac exhaled through his nose. "So we got a dead man in the courtyard, time stop watch, and a theater ticket. What's next?" Mick stood, brushing the frost from his gloves. "Next, we find out who Gerald Lawson was, where he went after the Majestic Theater, why he wound up buried on the morning snow." Cast a look up at the towering Gothic spires of City Hall. Because someone wanted this body found, but not too soon. Mac smirked. "I bet they're hoping we never put the pieces together." Mick adjusted his hat. "Then they clearly don't know us." Chapter 2. The Last Hours of Gerald Lawson. The Majestic Theater was a grand old place, the kind that still carried the glamour of an earlier era. Chandeliers cast warm pools of light over the deep red carpeting. The faint scent of cigar smoke and brandy lingered despite the city's newer restrictions. The marquee outside still displayed last night's show, The Winter Waltz, a romantic drama that had drawn in both the cultured elite and starry-eyed couples alike. Mick and Mack pushed through the double doors, shaking off the cold as they stepped into the dimly lit lobby. The uniformed usher, looking to be in his late 20s, eyed them warily. "Detectives," Mick said, flashing his badge and showing the usher a photo of Jerry Lawson in better times. "We need to ask you about a man who attended the show last night. Gerald Lawson. Might have left early." The usher hesitated. "Lawson, yeah, I remember him. Well dressed but nervous. Came alone. He left before the final act, muttering about being late for something." "Late for what?" Mac asked. The usher shrugged. "No idea. But he wasn't in a good mood. Looked like he'd seen a ghost." "Did he talk to anyone?" Mick pressed. "Argue with someone?" The usher thought for a moment. "Not inside. But I saw him hanging around the entrance after he left, like he was waiting for someone, pacing. Then this guy in a dark coat showed up, tall, sharp-dressed, but with a real mean look about him. They exchanged some words, and Jerry looked rattled." They leave together? Mick asked. No, the usher said. Jerry turned and walked off fast. The other guy lit a cigarette and watched him go. He didn't follow. He sure looked like he was thinking about it. Mick and Mack exchanged a glance. Someone had been waiting for Lawson. Whoever it was, they weren't done with him yet. As they walked out of the theater and back into the cold, Mick could tell Mack was thinking. The lips moving gave it away. Let's go back to City Hall and walk this through again. Something just isn't right, Mack finally spoke up. Mick smiled. I was figuring you were on to something or deciding what to have for lunch. Back at City Hall, the detective stood in the courtyard. Mick gestured toward the ground. No sign of a struggle, no blood in the snow around him. If he'd gone down here, the impact would have disturbed the drift, even with the storm. Instead, it's like he was just placed here. Mack considered that, looking around. So somebody dumped him here in the middle of a blizzard. Risky move. Or a smart one, Mick countered. The storm would have given them cover, low visibility, fewer people out, and fresh snow to hide their tracks. They knew exactly where to put him so he wouldn't be found right away. Mack glanced at the surrounding streets, already filled with city workers clearing away the storm's mess. You think our killer had inside knowledge on the cleanup? Wouldn't be surprised. Could be someone with the city, courthouse staff, or even a cop. Someone who knew him which parts of the city would be left alone until morning. Someone who wanted the body found, but not too soon. Mick exhaled, his breath curling in the cold air. Whoever did this planned it down to the last snowflake. Mack sighed. Great. A killer who knows how to use the weather to their advantage. I hate smart murderers. They're in the wrong line of work, Mick replied dryly. Chapter 3. A Visit to the Blue Canary. After their chilly encounter at the Majestic Theater, Mick and Mack found themselves outside the Blue Canary, a dimly lit jazz club tucked between a tailor's shop and a bakery that smelled of burnt bread. It was the kind of place where the music was loud enough to cover conversations and the clientele had more secrets than spare change. The neon sign flickered like a faulty heartbeat, casting eerie blue light over the slushy sidewalk. Mick stomped the snow off his shoes. Nothing like a warm gin joint to shake off a cold case. Mick smirked. I'm guessing the gin's warmer than the welcome we'll get. They stepped inside. The scent of cigarette smoke, whiskey, and cheap perfume clung to the air like a desperate lover. A small jazz quartet played in the corner stage, the brass section fighting to be heard over the murmur of conversation. At the far end of the bar, Vic Morelli, the club's owner, leaned against the counter, swirling a glass of bourbon like a man with too much time and too little conscience. The moment Vic saw them, his expression tightened. Well, if it isn't Toronto's finest. He spread his hands in mock welcome. What brings you gentlemen out on a night like this? Mick flashed a dry smile. Body in the snow, Vic. Ring any bells? Vic took a slow sip of his drink. Lots of things end up in the snow, detective. People lose hats, gloves, their dignity. Matt cut in. How about Gerald Lawson? That's what he lost. Vic's fingers paused in his glass. Name's familiar. He set his drink down. Came around now and then. Bit of a nervous fella. Never stayed long. Mick studied him. Last time he was here? Vic scratched his chin. A few nights ago, maybe. Sat at the bar, nursed a drink. Didn't talk much, left looking over his shoulder. Mack arched a brow. That doesn't raise a red flag for you? Vic shrugged. A lot of guys leave here looking over their shoulder. That's the nature of the clientele. Mick leaned in slightly. We know Lawson had a run-in with someone outside the Majestic last night. Someone in a dark coat. Any chance he had enemies? Vic exhaled through his nose. If he did, I doubt he made him here. Look, detectives, I run a respectable business. The less I know about my customers, the better. Mac smirked. And yet, you seem to know exactly when they show up and how they act. Before Vic could respond, a voice interrupted. I remember Lawson. They turned to see Lily Morgan, the club's resident singer, perched on a bar stool with a cocktail in hand. She was dressed in a sleek emerald gown, her red lipstick in stark contrast to her pale skin. Her eyes held a knowing glint. Mick nodded. Go on. She tilted her glass thoughtfully. It wasn't a regular. I saw him the night before the storm. He was talking to a man at the bar, older, well-dressed, not the usual crowd. Mac narrowed his eyes. Know the guy? She shook her head. Didn't catch a name. But they weren't just chatting. Click Lawson was trying to convince him of something. He was pleading. Mick exchanged a glance with Mac. And the older man? Lily pursed her lips. Didn't look convinced. Mac sighed. Sounds like he had a lot of problems. Lily took a sip of her drink. Now he's got none at all. Mick nodded. Let us know if you remember anything else. The club's bartender, polishing a glass, spoke up. There was another guy causing a stir that night, too. Mick turned to him. Oh? The bartender nodded. Not inside, but out front. A judge. One of the ones involved in that big fraud trial. I saw him arguing with someone on the sidewalk. Looked tense. Then he got into a waiting car and took off. Mac exhaled. A judge mixed up in all this? That's interesting. Mick nodded. Interesting. And worth looking into. As he turned to leave, Vic called after them. You boys watch yourselves. Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep. Mick didn't turn around. That's a problem, Vic. We like the dirt. As they stepped back out into the cold, the mystery of Gerald Lawson felt thicker than the snowflakes drifting down around them. Chapter 4. A Storm of Secrets. The warmth of the Blue Canary quickly became a distant memory as Mick and Mack trudged back through the icy streets toward City Hall. The case was growing colder by the minute, but one thing was clear. Gerald Lawson had made powerful enemies, and one of them had gone to great lengths to silence him. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of polished wood and fading cigarette smoke. It was quieter than usual, the aftermath of the storm leaving fewer people around than normal. The detectives made their way to Judge Walter Pembroke's office, the nameplate in the door glinting under the hallway's dim lighting. Mick knocked sharply. A gruff voice entered. Enter. They stepped inside to find Judge Pembroke at his desk, a man with a square jaw and tired eyes. His robes were draped over the back of his chair, and an untouched cup of coffee sat steaming by his elbow. Detectives, he said, his voice heavy with irritation. To what do I owe the pleasure? Mac pulled out a chair without waiting for an invitation. Gerald Lawson. You know the name? Pembroke's expression remained unreadable. I know many names, detective. This one was found dead in the snow outside, Mick said, watching for any reaction. We have reason to believe he had information about a certain fraud case. One where you let a rather wealthy businessman off the hook. Pembroke's lips thinned. I don't appreciate what you're implying. The law speaks for itself. The case was dismissed due to lack of concrete evidence. Or was it dismissed because of a payout? Mac leaned in, voice low. We hear whispers, Judge, and we're not the only ones. Maybe Lawson had more than whispers. Maybe he had proof. For the first time, Pembroke's composure wavered. He reached for his coffee, but didn't drink it. I don't know what Lawson had, but if you're suggesting I had something to do with his death, you're barking up the wrong tree. Mick studied him for a moment longer before standing. If you think of anything helpful, you know where to find us. Pembroke didn't respond, but his fingers drummed against the desk as they left. Outside, the wind had picked up again, biting at their faces as they stepped onto the courthouse steps. Mac stuffed his hands into his coat pockets. Think he's dirty? Mick exhaled, his breath fogging in the air. If he's not, he's scared of someone who is. Before they could discuss it further, a voice called out, Detectives! They turned to see an elderly newspaper vendor, bundled up against the cold, hurrying toward them. His face was lined with years of street knowledge, and he clutched a stack of unsold papers under one arm. I heard you boys asking about that fella, Lawson, he said between shivers. I saw something that night. Might be important. Mac perked up. Let's hear it. The vendor leaned in. There was a man in a city worker's uniform, big guy, leading another man through the storm toward the courthouse courtyard. Thought it was odd at the time, but with all the snow, I figured maybe the fella needed help getting inside. Didn't think twice until I heard about the body. Mick's pulse quickened. You get a good look at the worker? Couldn't see his face too well, the vendor admitted. I remember the coat. One of those patches, you know, from the city maintenance crews? Mac whistled. So our killer wasn't just using the storm to hide the body. It might have been part of the cleanup effort. Mick nodded. That means he had knowledge of the best place to dump a body without getting caught. The vendor wiped his nose and glanced around. That's all I got. Just figured you ought to know. Mick reached into his coat and pressed a few bills into the man's gloved hand. Thanks. You see anything else, you find us. As the vendor shuffled away, Mac exhaled. So what's next? Mick glanced toward the courthouse, then down the street where a few city plows were still working. Next, we find out which city worker was out here that night. And if we're lucky, we find the one who had reason to make sure Lawson never spoke again. Mac grinned, and here I thought our day was winding down. Mick adjusted his fedora against the wind. Not a chance. Chapter 5. The Final Puzzle Piece. The day began with the body in the snow, now was ending with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. Judge Pembroke wasn't their killer. He was a man with secrets, sure, but the terror in his eyes had been real. He wasn't pulling the strings. He was tangled in them. Mick and Mack stood in the courthouse hallway, watching as the judge's office door clicked shut behind them. So Pembroke didn't kill Lawson, Mac said, adjusting his scarf. Who did? Mick exhaled, rubbing his jaw in thought. Someone close to the courthouse. Someone who knew what Lawson was after. Their next move took them to the courthouse records room. A deep dive into case files, payroll logs, and old testimony revealed a name that kept cropping up in the background. Arthur Lyle, a longtime courthouse clerk. He wasn't just an administrator. He handled confidential files, processed sensitive documents, and as it turned out, had a long history of quietly covering for Pembroke's questionable dealings. He's the guy who does the dirty work, but never gets his hands too dirty, Mac muttered, flipping through the pages. If someone like Lawson came to him thinking he could shake him down, Lyle wouldn't just turn him away, Mick finished. He'd make sure he never talked again. Tracking Lyle wasn't difficult. He was still inside the courthouse, but not in his usual office. A janitor mentioned seeing him heading toward the boiler room beneath the building, muttering about unfinished work. Unfinished work, my foot, Mac muttered as they descended the dimly lit stairway. Bet you $10 he's down there burning evidence. Mick didn't take the bet. The basement was a maze of low ceilings, rattling pipes and thick air laced with the scent of oil and dust. The faint flicker of firelight danced against the walls as they approached the boiler room door. Mick pushed it open, revealing Arthur Lyle, hunched over an old metal drum feeding documents into the flames. Arthur Lyle barely looked up as Mick and Mack approached, thin fingers methodically sorting through a stack of legal briefs. He's a wiry man in his 50s with spectacles that perched precariously on his nose and a look of permanent exhaustion. "Detectives," he murmured, not surprised. "I was wondering when you'd get here?" Mack arched a brow. "Not going to ask why we're here?" Lyle sighed, setting a folder aside. "Because I already know. You're here about Lawson." Mick stepped forward. "Why would you know that?" Lyle removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Because Gerald Lawson was a fool. A fool who thought he had leverage in a game he didn't understand." "You mean the fraud case?" Mack said. "I mean the man behind it." Lyle leaned back against the desk. "Lawson approached me a few weeks ago. Said he knew the case was fixed. The Pembroke had been bought off. Thought he could get me to help him expose it." He gave a humorless chuckle. "As if I'd stick my neck out for him." Mick folded his arms. "You didn't just turn him away, did you?" Lyle's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, I saw an opportunity." Mack shook his head. "You went to the guy who bought Pembroke, didn't you?" Lyle nodded slowly. "I owed him. I'd been in his payroll longer than Pembroke. When Lawson came to me, I realized I could kill two birds with one stone. Get rid of a nuisance. Improve my loyalty." Mick's voice was cold. "So you killed him?" Lyle shrugged. "I didn't plan on it. But he wouldn't let it go. He kept pushing, kept thinking he could buy his way out of trouble. He didn't realize he was already dead the moment he stepped into this mess." Mack's jaw tightened. "And the storm gave you cover." Lyle sighed. "It was too easy. I told him I had documents, that I meet him outside during the storm. Walked him right into the blind spot of the courtyard. No witnesses, no struggle. The cold did half the work for me." He met their eyes, and by the time the snow cleared, it was someone else's problem. Mick's voice was quiet but sharp. "Except now, it's yours." Lyle gave a small, weary nod. "I suppose it is." Lyle looked up sharply, glasses sliding down his nose. "You're too late," he said, his voice calm and his hands trembling as they hovered over a stack of remaining papers. "The truth is already ashes." "We'll take what's left," Mick said, stepping forward. "And you." Lyle's hand darted under his coat. Before either detective could react, he produced a small revolver, pointing it straight at Mick's chest. "I don't think so, detectives." Mack raised his hand slowly. "Careful, pal. Guns have a funny way of ruining your retirement plans." Lyle's finger tensed over the trigger. "I should have gotten rid of both of you sooner." "I should have." That's when Mack spotted it. A mop bucket, precariously perched on the edge of the boiler room's grated floor. He shifted his stance slightly and, with a well-placed nudge of his foot, sent the bucket careening forward. The bucket slammed into Lyle's shin, sending him staggering backward. His gun fired. A single deafening shot, then missed by a mile, ricocheting off the pipes. Mack lunged, tackling Lyle into the metal shelving, sending files and rags tumbling down on top of him. The struggle was brief, punctuated by a series of crashes as the shelving collapsed, finally ending with Mack pinning Lyle against the cold concrete. Lyle groaned, his glasses askew, his face pressed into a grimy puddle. "That was absurd." Mack grinned, wrenching the gun from Lyle's grasp. "That's how we like it." The cuffs clicked shut around Lyle's wrists as the uniformed officers led him away. The remaining documents, charred at the edges but still legible, were recovered from the drum, enough to connect him directly to the businessman who had pulled the strings behind Pembroke's fraud case. Outside, the storm had finally died, leaving the city blanketed in white under the dim glow of street lamps. Mac exhaled, watching the last of the snow swirl at his feet. A courthouse clerk. Who'd have guessed? Mick adjusted his hat. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones nobody sees. Mac chuckled. Think this means Pembroke's going to sleep easier tonight? Mick smirked. I doubt it. Might not have killed Lawson, but he's still in the game. And something tells me the people he works for don't like loose ends. Mac nodded toward the street. Come on, let's get a drink. Mick sighed. As long as it's not the Blue Canary. Mac grinned. Deal. As they walked away, the city hummed back to life. The echoes of a crime, buried beneath the drift, finally laid to rest. Chapter 6. Aftermath. The storm had passed, but its wreckage remained. Not in the streets, those being cleared with efficiency, but in the halls of power where the whispers of corruption have finally been forced into the open. Judge Pembroke resigned quietly, his name never making the headlines, his departure disguised as an early retirement for personal reasons. He might have avoided a jail cell, but his career was finished, and whatever protection he'd once enjoyed was slipping away. As for the businessman who pulled the strings, the investigation into his dealings had begun in earnest, though Mick and Mack both knew it would be an uphill battle. His lawyers were already circling like hawks, bearing evidence, silencing witnesses, making sure their client walked away untouched. Justice, as always, was a slow, uneasy thing. And then there was Arthur Lyle, the man who had done the dirty work, the man who had killed Gerald Lawson with the belief that his loyalty would be rewarded. He was wrong. Lyle confessed under pressure, expecting his employer to step in, to buy his way out like always. When the time came, the businessman washed his hands of him. Lyle was nothing more than an inconvenience now, one that would rot behind bars while his former boss continued whining and dining in the city's finest establishments. Mac leaned back in his chair at the precinct, stretching his arms behind his head. Always funny, isn't it? The guys at the top always have someone to take the fall. Mick stirred his coffee, watching the steam curl into the air. The difference is, Lyle thought he mattered. Mac shook his head. A guy like that, nobody even remembers his name by next week. The precinct window rattled slightly as a gust of wind blew against it, but outside, the city was different now. The snow was melting, puddles forming where drifts had once stood. The streets gleamed under the streetlights, slick but alive. Mick took a sip of coffee, then the warmth settled in his chest. Another case closed. Mac grinned. Yeah, and now we wait for the next poor sucker who thinks he can outsmart the system. Mick smirked. Some things never change. Outside, the last of snow melted away, revealing the city beneath. Unchanged but forever shifting, the whispers of its secrets, never truly silenced. Thank you for listening. I'm Jay Nickel. Of Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. And this has been a Mick and Mack Mystery.